This morning I met with Speaker Zellers and Majority Leader Koch for about 40 minutes, and we had a cordial discussion. I gave him a letter which I'll read in a minute. Then I met just after that with the DFL legislative leaders and provided them with copies of the letter, which I've also provided to you. And the letter says, "Dear Senator Koch and Speaker Zellers, from the beginning of this legislative session, it has been clear that compromise by all of us would be the only way we could reach the necessary agreements to achieve a balanced state budget for the next biennium. Most Minnesotans want us to resolve our differences by the constitutional deadline of May 23rd. That resolution obviously requires compromise. Compromise requires all of us to agree two items that we don't agree with. That is the essence of compromise. It is the only way we will reconcile our different positions on the state's budget for the next biennium. The current projected deficit is just over $5 billion. We agree that the repayment of the previous governor and legislature's shift in school aid payments must be postponed. That leaves us with a remaining deficit of $3.6 billion. You propose to eliminate that deficit entirely through spending reductions. I have proposed to eliminate it through a combination of tax increases and spending reductions. I'm willing to meet you halfway, $1.8 billion in spending cuts and $1.8 billion in additional tax revenues. In my February 15th budget, I proposed $3.356 billion in new tax revenues. I'm willing to cut my revenue proposal almost in half to $1.8 billion. I will also agree to $1.8 billion in net spending reductions to be negotiated with you. Your proposed budget calls for eliminating the remaining $3.6 billion deficit entirely through reductions in expenditures. Thus, halfway for you would also be $1.8 billion in spending cuts and $1.8 billion in additional tax revenues. My new tax proposal raises the gross income levels at which the fourth-tier income tax rate applies for the typical married couple to over $300,000, $250,000 in taxable income, and to almost $180,000 for the typical single taxpayer, $150,000 in taxable income. It would raise income taxes on less than 2% of Minnesotans, actually 1.9%. Only the very highest income earners would pay any additional state income taxes under my proposal. And I've attached the details of that proposal. I also withdraw my proposed property tax increases on homes valued over $1 million. Thus, my proposal would not increase state or local property taxes for anyone in Minnesota. By contrast, the Minnesota Department of Revenue estimates that the cuts in your conference report of over $800 million to local government aid would increase property taxes on almost all Minnesota property owners and businesses by about $400 million, while also cutting funds for local services by nearly $400 million. In addition, your cuts of $186 million to the renter's property tax refund would reduce property tax refunds by more than 45% for 308,000 Minnesotans, including nearly 85,000 seniors and disabled Minnesotans. Regarding K-12 education expenditures, I agree to the Senate's position, which increases the state's per-pupil aid formula by $50 in 2012 and additional $50 in 2013 at a cost of $128 million for the biennium. However, I would obtain that amount from revenues, not from reducing other education funding. That would then require $1.928 billion in spending reductions, which I am willing to negotiate with you. My compromise represents a balanced approach to a balanced budget. One half of the remaining $3.6 billion would be eliminated by spending cuts, and one half by tax revenue increases. This is the reasonable, responsible middle ground. If you agree to meet me halfway and adopt this balanced approach to a balanced budget, I am confident we can resolve our remaining differences in time for you to meet your constitutional deadline of May 23rd for adjournment. My best regards, Mark Dayton. I'm willing to consider other proposals. I like mine the best because it only affects less than 2% of Minnesotans, the very wealthiest Minnesotans who can afford to pay more taxes, and doesn't raise either income taxes or property taxes for 98% of the people of Minnesota, and yet raises $1.8 billion in revenue. I think that's a very good proposal for 98% of Minnesota, and a reasonable one under the circumstances, and I ask for their forbearance and support until we get out of this deficit for the very top 2%. But if somebody else wants to offer a alternative, then they're welcome to do